All right, today we're going to finish off the lectures on the nervous system, and we are going to take a tour of the brain and look at some of the internal structures. All right, so this is a flow chart of how I'm going to set up the lecture. We're going to work our way up. We're going to start at the medulla oblongata. We'll start there. Remember that that's where the spinal cord starts and then turns into the medulla oblongata. We'll work our way up to the pons. We'll talk about the mesencephalon. We'll talk about the diencephalon. We'll move over to the cerebellum. And then we will end by talking about the cerebrum and all of its many functions. All right, so let's start here with the medulla oblongata. So because of its location, it is really a relay center or transit center. There's a lot of traffic moving through the medulla oblongata on its way up from the spinal cord. So you'll see ascending white columns of the spinal cord to other regions of the brain, or motor information descending down to the anterior white columns of the spinal cord. And there's some very important areas that we're going to talk about and some important nuclei that have to do with autonomic functions. All right, so let's move to this slide and start to explore the medulla oblongata. So again, all communication between the brain and the spinal cord is going to pass through this area. And it's mostly white matter. There's a lot of axons going on here. And if you remember, the ascending sensory information is the afferent tract. And the descending motor information is the efferent tract. And these tracts, again, are equivalent to nerves in the peripheral nervous system. But in the central nervous system, we call them tracts, and they are grouped together by similar function. So we're also going to have some coordination of autonomic functions that reside here. So let me summarize the parts of the medulla oblongata that I want you to know. So we already just talked about these ascending and descending tracts that link the medulla oblongata with the spinal cord and then to the rest of the brain. The two other areas that I want to talk about are the reflex centers and the olivary nuclei. And I'm going to start with the reflex centers. So there's two portions of this. There's a cardiovascular control center and a respiratory control center. And what the cardiovascular center is doing is regulating our heart rate. So it's forcing the contraction of the heart and then respective blood vessels. And in the respiratory center, this is where signals are going to come out regularly to contract your diaphragm so that you can breathe. So the basic rhythm of not having to think about breathing is happening in the respiratory center. And then lastly, we'll talk about the olivary nuclei. So remember, these are not just tracts. This is actually, since they're referred to as nuclei, so this is a nucleus. This is a group of neuron cell bodies with a shared function. And what they are doing is they are connecting information to and from the spinal cord. And they also have regions within the midbrain, the cerebral cortex, and the cerebellum. And these connections that are going on here are not just axons. These are the actual nuclei. So let's take a closer look at this. So here you can see the medulla oblongata here and then a close-up of it blown up over here. So the medulla oblongata is on the left, and you can see the spinal cord below it. And then on each side, there's going to be white matter tracks that are going up and down. So that's what's pictured here. That's what these lateral white column tracks are that you see on both sides. Those are the white matter tracks. The olivary nucleus, which I apparently already outlined here, are in green. There's a pair of them. One is on each side. And behind the olivary nucleus is the cardiovascular center. That's what's shown in red. There are some other nuclei here in blue and yellow. We're not going to talk about those. You can probably spend an entire course talking about the nervous system, but we really just have to pick out some of the key topics to talk about and then move on from there. All right, let's leave the medulla oblongata behind and then move on to the pons, which you can see here in blue. This is the pons, all right? And the medulla oblongata is below it. And so there are two general functions of the pons. One is also a relay center, and one has to do with the subconscious. So we'll talk about the relay center first. So the relay center is also going to convey information to other parts of the brain. Let me show you this here. So here is where we're talking about the relay center. So it's similar to the medulla oblongata in the fact that it's relaying information to other parts of the brain. But the type of information is slightly different. So once again, we have white matter tracks that are going up and down. So you have the descending and ascending tracks in the pons, but you have something new here that's very specific to the pons compared to the medulla oblongata. And that is you will start to see transverse fibers. And this is what is going to allow you, this is going to cross over to one side of the brain or the other. So because we are bilateral organisms, we need to coordinate the right side of our body with the left side of our body. And if you remember, when we cross information from one side of the body to the other, it is called decussation. Do you remember that term? So another term that I'm going to bring back from the very first lecture is that for coordination of our body, we need contralateral processing so that we can share what the left side is doing with the right. So contralateral also means opposite sides. So for example, when we start walking, right, we need to communicate, each side of the body needs to communicate what is going on. There is gray matter in the pons, okay, and that has to do with the respiratory center. So it's similar to what we saw with the medulla oblongata, but it's a little bit different. So what's happening in the pons is that we have the ability to speed up the rate and depth of our breathing. So there are different types of muscles are involved in controlling whether we breathe at a faster rate. And this is what the respiratory center of the pons is doing. This is going to modify the output of the respiratory centers. Let me show you in a picture of what this looks like. So again, the pons is highlighted here on the left, and then we get a blown up image of the pons on the right. So there's still a lot of white matter tracks here. So the blue lines are showing you the ascending tracks, the sensory information. So sensory is in blue. The sensory information. And then the red track, or the red line, is showing you the motor tracks. So we do have some of these white matter tracks that are running up and down through the pons. But what it's also showing you now is that you can see these transverse fibers. And these transverse fibers are going to allow different parts of the body to communicate, right? So it could lead to the cerebellum or other parts of the brain. And this is the first time we're seeing these types of fibers. Those respiratory centers that I was talking about, here are those nuclei here in blue. So now we're going to leave the pons and move on to the mesencephalon. All right, and remember that the mesencephalon is the midbrain, and this is where things get really interesting. So we've already talked about the importance, and it's definitely important to have functional control over the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. But things are going to get a little bit more complicated here in the mesencephalon. And we are going to look at multiple systems here. So we're going to have processing of visual and auditory data. And this is going to generate, and I'm going to explain all of this on the next slide, reflexive motor movement, and we'll have some maintenance of our consciousness. So let's talk about what all of that means in a little bit more detail. So again, this is just summarizing that there's a lot of complex activity that's going on in the mesencephalon. And I want to explain some of these to you. So there's a lot of complex motor patterns that are going to happen, that's happening at the subconscious level. And this is going to influence the entire nervous system. Let's take a closer look at what I'm talking about and the areas that we're going to discuss here. So like the other images, we're looking at the mesencephalon and then a close-up of that region. And there are several features here that are important. There's some very important nuclei, including the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi that we're going to discuss on the next slide, the substantia nigra and the red nucleus. So those are the important nuclei that I want to talk about. There's one other feature, the cerebral peduncles, and these are largely white matter tracts. These are myelinated axons that are going to transport information to and from the central nervous system. All right, so that's what the peduncles are. I forgot to mention them, but I want to get back to these 4 nuclei. All right, so the first nuclei we're going to look at are called the corpora quadragemina. And there's 4 bodies, and I'll show you on an image. These are sensory nuclei. They are a collection of cell bodies with sensory information. So the superior colliculus, so colliculus means hill, and it's because of the way it looks. I'll show you on the next slide. This is going to receive visual data from the eyes. But it's not processing a visual image like, if you look at an apple and you say that's an apple. This is different. Instead, it's taking visual information and linking it to reflexes. So let's say we're walking along and something comes out at you. Like those people that dress up like plants and then they jump out at you and scares the crap out of you. So what your normal reflex is to really move quickly out of the way. And this reflex is what is controlling that. So what happens is your eyes, your head, and your neck, you respond to that frightening human being dressed as a plant jumping out at you. And this is a reflex that you have. This is something that we're born with. This is not something we learn. It's like, preparing to fight for your life kind of thing. So your response, what you're doing, is happening without you even thinking about it. It's a survival function, if you will. And so the inferior colliculus, it's kind of in the same, it's very similar. It's doing something very similar, but it's receiving auditory data. So hearing and initiating a reflex again. So again, you're walking in the woods and there's a crash behind you. What do you immediately do? You turn your head, your neck, your upper body, and you look at it to assess what danger is coming at me. And it's that turning of your head and looking at the noise, that's a reflex. It's automatic. So sensory information, Clearly I need to turn my notifications off. I apologize. So the last thing I was saying is sensory information is coming in and it's linking it to a complex body motion. So we're not thinking about it. It's a reflex. We don't learn it. We're born with it. So these are also called startle reflexes. So this would be a visual startle reflex, and this would be an auditory startle reflex. All right, so this is an image, and you can see the superior and inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi is up here. There's one on both sides, and here are the inferior colliculi. You're actually going to be able to see this when we do the brain dissection. And then the cerebral peduncles, I already talked about, that they have to do with those white matter tracts. But you can also see nicely this fourth ventricle. All right, let's move on to a couple of the other nuclei that I mentioned at the beginning that we have to talk about because these are pretty important regions of the brain. So we'll talk about the red nucleus. This is called the red nucleus because it has quite a bit of blood vessels in the area. And this is an area that's receiving information predominantly from the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And it's issuing commands to the upper limbs, but it's doing so in a subconscious way. So we're not aware of it. We're not consciously thinking about it. So if you go outside and you walk, one leg moves in front of the other. And if you ever noticed, your arms are swinging in opposite movements, like counterbalancing your legs. And that action of your arms swinging is a red nucleus function to sustain balance. So we don't think about movement of our arms when we're walking. So in this image, and then we'll come back to those other ones, this is a slice taken through the mesencephalon. You can see the cerebral aqueduct here, very nicely right there. You can see the superior and inferior colliculi. Oh, you can only see the superior in this picture. And then the two areas that are like fairly dark, they're right here. These are the red nuclei. And then the other area we're going to talk about is the substantia nigra. So let's go back and talk about the substantia nigra. This has a couple really important functions, and part of it functions as a reward center. So you do something that feels good and you get a sensation that you feel good about it, right? But this area is also there to help you control voluntary movement. So if we're looking at voluntary movement, right? So it smooths out these movements. So you can see, like with a patient with Parkinson's, they have a failure to have smooth movements, right? That's Parkinson's. You start to get tremors. You can't control the skeletal muscle movements anymore. That's what's happening in the substantia nigra. And then the reward center is also the center for addiction. Addiction reward kind of gone bad. You know, we can use an example, something even very simple, like there's some food that you like to eat, it tastes good, and then the reward center releases natural opioids. and it's like an endogenous morphine. It makes you feel good about what you just ate. Maybe it's chocolate, maybe it's French fries, and then you want more of it. And the reward center says every time you eat that, you will get a reward. And so you eat more of it, or you drink more of it, or you do more of it, right? And you can actually overstimulate this center, and eventually you get used to the sensation and it feels nice, and you still want more of it, and it just keeps going and going. That's all the substantia nigra. You can use a lot of examples in that situation. That's what's going on there. All right, so we talked about the red nucleus, the substantia nigra. We talked about the cerebral peduncles. We mentioned and we've gone over the aqueduct of the midbrain several times in several lectures. This is also a gentle reminder that that in the central nervous system, a cluster of neuron cell bodies, or soma, is called a nucleus. It is called a ganglion in the peripheral nervous system. All right, we're now going to move on to the diencephalon. The diencephalon has 3 regions. Only 2 of them are listed here: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and something called the epithalamus. So I've written that out for you on this slide. So let's talk about each of those regions. Let me show you the structures of them first. This is a cross-sectional view through the brain, and you can see these 3 regions. Let me outline them for you. So the epithalamus is here. I'll talk about the structures in the epithalamus. The thalamus is this egg-shaped structure in the middle, and then this structure over here is the hypothalamus. So let's start off by talking about the epithalamus. And the epithalamus is actually making the roof of the 3rd ventricle, if you remember where the ventricles are located. And so if you make 2 fists with your hand and put them together, that's the thalami. There's one in each hemisphere. They're egg-shaped. And in between the space of the thalamus, the thalami, is the 3rd ventricle. So the hypothalamus is the floor to that. Let me show you some of the structures of the epithalamus. So the epithalamus starts with the anterior commissure, which is right here. So again, I'm going to draw it for you, kind of the regions that encircle the epithalamus. The anterior commissure is a place where decussation occurs. So there are axons crossing over. And then because it's located near the 3rd ventricle, there is also a choroid plexus in this area that is going to be making up cerebrospinal fluid. And then the last structure I want to talk about is the pineal gland. All right, so you've probably heard of the hormone melatonin before, and the pineal gland is producing this hormone. So this is allowing us to have those day-night cycling that we have. The pineal gland also makes other hormones that regulate the female menstrual cycle. The next structure of the diencephalon that we're going to talk about is the paired thalami. Again, they form the walls of the 3rd ventricle, and they serve as the final relay station to sensory signals that are coming up from the spinal cord. So this is a sensory organ. So no matter what kind of sensory information, whether it's somatic sensory from the skin or vision or hearing, all of it goes to the thalamus first, and then it goes to the cerebrum for processing. So why is all this, why is all the sensory information coming here first? What is the thalamus doing? The thalamus is acting as a filter. It is only allowing some of the information to pass up to the cerebrum, to our consciousness. So let me show you another picture to put this all together. So this oval here in the center, this is representing the thalami, and it is buried between the cerebral hemispheres. Let me show you what it looks like in 3D. So this is another image. You can also see the peduncles of the midbrain here. Remember, those are white matter tracts. So what I want you to notice is the optic chiasm here and the optic tract. Okay, so this is coming from, these are nerves coming from the eyes. All right, and this is leading to a nucleus right here. There's actually two of them called the lateral geniculate nucleus. And then there's another one called the medial geniculate nucleus. And these are two of many nuclei that are in the thalamus. Here is another view showing you, so look right here, this is a blown up picture of the thalamus. And all these different colors are handling different kinds of sensory information. So each one of these is handling different types of sensory information. But the two that we're going to focus on, because there's a lot of material here, is the lateral and medial geniculate nucleus. And these are some of the smallest, actually, although they are doing some really important stuff. So let me take you back a slide. So the lateral geniculate nucleus is receiving visual signals from the eyes. So let's say you're watching a TV program or staring at a computer screen. And then you realize that also, because I just said that, you realize in your visual field there's a lot of other things, like maybe your coffee cup, your pen, the speaker, a picture of your family or your kids. There's other things around you. But all that visual information, all of that is there, but all you are seeing and what you're focusing on is what's on the screen. But now that I say that, you realize what else is in your visual field. So what is happening is the lateral geniculate nucleus is filtering out all the things that are not important at the moment. Otherwise, we would be overwhelmed with all of the information coming in, and this allows us to focus. So in the same vein, the medial geniculate nucleus, this is going to also act as a filter, but this is acting in a little bit of a different way. So this is visual, and this is auditory. And so you can probably guess how the medial geniculate nucleus is working in the auditory way. So it's also acting as a filter. So if you put yourself in a large room, like a social event, and there's lots of people talking and lots of noise, but you're standing in front of just two people having a conversation because you have the ability to filter out all those other conversations. But all of a sudden, in a cluster of people and you hear your name, you can immediately then pay attention to a different conversation. You are able to shift your audible attention to listen to that other conversation. So what allowed you to do that was the medial geniculate nucleus. So when you're focused on a conversation in front of you, you can filter out that background noise. Your brain is saying none of that other stuff is important, but I'm going to focus on what so-and-so is saying. So each area of the thalamus is doing this type of sensory filtering. So without these filters, our consciousness would be overwhelmed. All right, so let's see where we are. All right, so this is what I just went over while I was showing you that picture. And now we are going to move on to the last part of the diencephalon, which is the hypothalamus. And I want to start by showing you an image of the hypothalamus, and then we'll work on some of the functions. So you can see here we've taken an image of the hypothalamus and we've blown it up here so that you can see it. And what this image is trying to convey is that the hypothalamus is filled with individual nuclei. That's what all of these different colors are representing. And they are grouped together with common functions. All right, so you can see that there's going to be an array of essential functions for our body. So you can see all of these different nuclei located here in the hypothalamus, all of these different colors. All right, and then there's one other one. I'm going to come back to the mammillary body. This is also part of the hypothalamus. And again, I'll talk about it. And then there's a non-hypothalamus structure right here called the infundibulum, and attached to that is the pituitary gland. And all the actions of the pituitary gland are controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is actually a master controller. So what is the hypothalamus doing? So the better question for the hypothalamus really is, what is the hypothalamus not doing? So when it comes to basic functions for survival and basic living, the hypothalamus is the master controller. So I'm never going to ask you to give me a complete list of the actions of the hypothalamus, but it is good to be able to understand 2 or 3 of the functions of this structure. So let's talk about some of these functions. The hypothalamus is involved in visceral sensory functions, so some of the autonomic functions. And so what's happening is input is coming in. So the hypothalamus is looking at how much oxygen or CO or carbon dioxide is in the blood. What is the composition of the cerebral spinal fluid or other circulating chemicals, including hormones. So there's autonomic sensors, and we talked about the cardiovascular and respiratory centers of the medulla oblongata and the pons. These centers are subject to the hypothalamus telling them what they should be doing in response to all the other information coming on. So for example, for breathing, right, we talked about the medulla oblongata setting the rhythm that controls the diaphragm. And then the pons modifies that behavior based on your level of activity. So the hypothalamus, though, let's say an example is you're watching a horror movie and you know the bad guy is about to jump out soon. And your heart rate goes up, you start to get that feeling of fear, so there's a lot of like reactions going on. That's the hypothalamus telling the pons and the medulla that it's time to adjust. Or maybe you have some memory that changes your respiratory rate. These are higher centers that are making this response possible. The hypothalamus also plays a role in the temperature, like regulating body temperature. So it can adjust sweat glands and blood flow to adjust so that you don't get too hot or too cold. It's also going to work with the pineal gland to coordinate day-night cycles, with activity and inactivity. It's going to release hormones. So the target of these hormones are mostly the pituitary gland. There's also the hypothalamus also controls our behavioral drive, such as thirst and hunger centers. Also, like when you've had enough to eat. And then there's some subconscious control of motor patterns. And the simplest way to explain this is coming back to those mammillary bodies that I showed you a couple slides ago. And this is our ability to lick, swallow, and suck. Like these reflexes that we're born with, right? So we don't have to teach a baby how to suckle. These are motor functions, and these are all controlled by the hypothalamus. This next slide talks about the infundibulum, which is what I talked about. I showed you that that narrow stalk that leads from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. And then we just went over the mammillary bodies, which controls those feeding reflexes that all babies are born with. And this picture is showing you some of those functions that we just talked about. Here's the infundibulum, and then the pituitary gland is down here. Let's move on to the cerebellum. That is our last structure before we finally get to the cerebrum. So here is a picture of the cerebellum and then a blown up view of the cerebellum. It is located posteriorly. This image is pulled out and away so you can see the two hemispheres of the cerebellum, the left and the right. There is a structure running in the middle called the vermis. This is Latin for worm. It separates the two regions. The surface of the cerebellum has these deep folds. So I'm going to introduce you to two new terms, gyrus and sulcus. Plural is gyri and sulci. All right, the gyri are the bulges. They're very thin. And there are deep grooves. The deep grooves are called the sulci. Together, they form a structure called the folia of the cerebellum. Folia means leaf or page. So these are stacked leaves or pages. All right, let me show you what this looks like. Hold on, I'm going to come back to some of this. I talked about the vermis already. All right, we talked about the folia, but I want to show you, where's my cross section? All right, here's a cross section. You can see these deep divisions here that are forming the folia. So here, 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 all of that, that's the folia. You get a better sense of this tissue when you can see it in cross section. Let me show you that the cerebellum is more than that structure. It actually comes all the way around right here. And there are cerebellar peduncles, which are white matter tracts that we've seen in various structures in the brain that run up and down, that they have axons that are running up and down. I'd also like to point out that right here, oh, my pen isn't working. Why? Oh, I lost my ability to write. I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. All right. So right here, sorry about that. I wanted to point out is the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is encased in the cerebellar tissue. So note that in the cerebellum, as in the case with the cerebrum, the gray matter or the nuclei, right, the cells that are making decisions are superficial. This is gray matter right here, is superficial. And the white matter right here is deep. That's the, oh, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. White matter is deep. The white matter takes on a very specific appearance in the cerebellum. It has this branching appearance, which gives it its name, arbor vitae, which means the tree of life. All right, so you can see this very nicely on dissection. So let's see, I believe I went over all of this. Sometimes I think it's better to go over it in picture format, so I didn't just read it to you. All right, we are now moving on to the, oh wait, I need to talk about the functions of the cerebellum. This is actually pretty important. All right, so what does the cerebellum do? There are two dominant functions that the cerebellum has. All right, so one has to do with postural muscles of the body. And so there's something called a proprioceptor. And these receptors are constantly monitoring the position of our joints and limbs to adjust for posture. So the fact that you can sit and watch a video and not face plant is your cerebellum making sure that you continue to sit upright. Okay, that's that. The second one has to do with fine tuning of muscle actions. So you've heard of the term muscle memory, right? This is where your muscle memory resides. So when you learn an action, so you can think back to when you first learned how to ride a bike and how maybe disastrous that was. But over time, you learn these very complex motor activities. You can control your skeletal muscles, you can control your balance. Then you can go 5 or 10 years without ever riding a bike, but you hop on a bike and just like that, you're riding a bike again. You stored those motor actions in the cerebellum. And interestingly, the cerebellum is highly susceptible to certain drugs like alcohol. So alcohol will impair your ability to make sense of the proprioceptors and the information and fine-tuning of motor skills. And this could lead to something called ataxia. All right, and this can be temporary or permanent. Like temporary is going to be if you are using drugs or alcohol. Permanent would be if you've had like blunt force trauma to your cerebellum. And what will happen is you won't be able to coordinate your muscular actions. So this is what happens in a field sobriety test. They're actually testing your proprioceptors and your ability to, close your eyes and touch your fingertips to your nose. This requires coordination of the proprioceptors. And so if you're drinking or you're drunk, you won't be able to touch your nose. You're going to touch your forehead or your mouth, or you can't walk in a straight line. So those are the actions of the cerebellum. All right, so I got ahead of myself a little bit before. Now we can move on to the final area of the brain, which is the cerebrum. So modern humans, most advanced vertebrates, this is the largest region of the brain. And so in humans, it has expanded beyond any other species. And it is divided into 5 lobes, which I'm going to show you. There's a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, occipital, temporal, and then there's one that you can only see in a mid-sagittal view called the insula. And as you can guess, a lot of these get their name from the skull bone that they reside near. All right, so here is an image of the brain. So there are two hemispheres, and there are 5 lobes on each side. So as I just pointed out, there's a frontal, a parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. So where is the insula? So this insula means island. And here, if you do a sagittal section, you can then see the other lobe, the insula. So let's talk about the surface anatomy first. So I'm going to do that on this slide so that you can begin to understand how the gray matter is organized. So the surface of the cerebrum itself, much like the cerebellum, has a series of folds and grooves and shallow depressions. So the bulges, again, are called the gyrus. And in between the gyri are narrow grooves called the sulcus. So you can see the bulges here. And then in between these lines here, that's the sulcus. I want to take you to one other image. All right, because I want to talk about, there's a couple deeper grooves that I want to mention, which are located here. Let me see where it is. Okay, right here. So they're in between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. There's something called a lateral sulcus. So this separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. It's on either side and it's a much deeper groove. There is another deeper groove called the central sulcus. So that's what's depicted here. And then in front of the central sulcus and behind the central sulcus, there are 2 other really important regions. One is called the precentral gyrus, and one is called the postcentral gyrus. And before I explain the functions of all of that, I want to show you these structures on a real brain, because we will be working and doing a dissection on the real brain. And the central sulcus is a little bit hard to see, but you can see it here. All right, and you can make out the lateral sulcus here. And then in front of the central sulcus, you'll have the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. All right, and I want to take you back one more time, and I apologize for all the movement going on here. I want to take you back to this slide and point out one other structure here, right here, called the corpus callosum. And this is a very prominent structure that you'll see when you do the dissection. This is entirely white matter. This is another area of decussation between the hemispheres. So there are myelinated axons crossing over between the right and left hemispheres. So you can coordinate the sides of the brain with the body. All right, now I want to pay close attention to the way that the gray matter is organized. So gray matter is all superficial. So that's what you're seeing here, right? Just like the cerebellum, but is opposite to the spinal cord. So, and then the white matter is deep. So the neocortex of the cerebrum, the gray matter, this is where all the decision making is occurring. And it's communicating to and from the rest of the body through the axons in the white matter. And in some areas, they need to decussate, right? They need to cross over here. That's what's happening. Decussation is happening at the corpus callosum. And you can also see, this is kind of a cool image because you can also make out these lateral ventricles. Those are the lateral ventricles. You can make out the third ventricle. You can make out the aqueduct. That's the aqueduct. You can see the fourth ventricle. And then you can see the central canal leading to the spinal cord. You can also see the folia of the cerebellum and the white and gray matter as well. So there's lots of features on this image. And the gray matter, just like in the spinal cord, is being handled in very specific regions. That pattern is going to occur here as well. So you have different parts of the cortex, the gray matter, that is aggregated into motor and sensory functions. So what's shown on here in the different colors are the different cortexes. So like the occipital lobe is green, and you have the visual cortex here, right? And then in blue, in the parietal lobe, you have, it's largely a sensory cortex. The frontal lobe, part of it is a motor cortex. And then in yellow, you have the auditory cortex. And there's also an olfactory cortex and a gustatory cortex, that's for taste. So each function, whether it's sensory or motor, has a region where gray matter is handling that function. All right, so let's take, as I said, I wanted to come back to this idea of the central sulcus and this post-central gyrus and precentral gyrus. So I'm going to do that now. And I apologize that the slides were a little bit out of order. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask about that in lab. I'm trying to go over everything and touch on everything. So hopefully I haven't missed anything. So you can see the central sulcus, okay? And then the post-central gyrus is part of your sensory cortex. So that's what is here. This is the post-central. Okay, so this is your primary somatosensory region, okay? So the somatic sensation, it's a sensation that you are aware of. This area receives information filtered through the thalamus first about touch, surface temperature, pressure, or pain in your skin. It's largely associated with skin. And this information goes here. The precentral gyrus, which is what you're seeing in red, that's the precentral. This is part of the motor cortex. And this darker red area is your primary somatic motor area. So when you decide to use a skeletal muscle, let's say to grab a pen or to drink from a cup, the action initiates from here. It will go through several parts of your brain, like the cerebellum, to coordinate this action, but it's eventually going to move down the spinal cord to the appropriate area. So all of these primary cortexes get raw information. It's handling all of the basic stuff. The other parts of the brain are going to coordinate it. So each area has its own association center or area that I want to talk about. And what are these association areas doing? They are processing and responding. So if I say, for example, the word apple, Right now, you heard those sounds. If it was in another language, you might not understand those sounds. But these association areas make sense of that word and process that raw information and try to make sense of it. And it integrates it with memory. So, two association areas I'm going to highlight and talk a little bit more about because they're pretty interesting. And both of them are involved with hearing. All right, so I'm going to focus on this and I'm going to spend some time kind of explaining what these association areas are. And I'm going to talk about two areas. They have very specific names to them. One of them is called Broca's area, and this helps you produce coherent speech. It controls the muscles you use to create words. So the sounds, right? So the tongue, the lips, the mouth, the vocal cords, they are all going to be used to say that word. All of these are motor functions. So this is how we take a thought on what we want to say and how we then are able to say that word. We're able to make that happen. The other area, and I'm going to give you examples in a minute, and even show you some additional videos. There's another area called Wernicke's. Wernicke's is involved in speech processing and understanding of a language. So you're going to hear information coming in like the word apple, and you're going to interpret it. And then if you want to respond in using speech, you will send commands to Broca's area to help you formulate that word. You're going to tell Broca's what it is that you want to say so that you can respond. So if I say, "Would you like an apple?" you would then say, "Yes, I would." So you heard and understood the question. And two, the right commands went to Broca's to say, "Yes, I do." There is a video of somebody, her name is Sarah Scott, and I'm going to attach links to the video for you to see. You really only need to watch maybe, the first minute or two. Sarah Scott had a stroke and she lost blood supply to Broca's area, which led to something called Broca's aphasia. So she understands perfectly what is being said, but she is unable to say it. So she knows what she wants to say in response. So if you ask her age, if you say, "What is your name?" she knows she can process that question, but she cannot command her muscles to make the words come out. Her ability to say words is compromised. And it's really actually cool because she has a lot of follow-up videos. They followed her over time, and it actually gets better over time. You can watch her progress. There's really, it won't take but 5 minutes for you to look at it, and I will provide those links. Wernicke's, on the other hand, Wernicke's aphasia, and again, I have another video of that. There is a gentleman who also had a stroke, and he can speak perfectly fine. He has no problem with Broca's area. His problem is understanding what is being asked of him or told of him. So when he speaks, he is very incoherent. The words that he that are all together, that he strings together, they don't make any sense. They virtually have no bearing on the question at hand. So that's unlike Sarah. Sarah knows exactly what she's trying to say. She just can't say it, which is very frustrating. What's unclear in Wernicke's is if they know what they're trying to say. So even if you ask them, they can't write a response out. They have no idea what you just asked. And again, I would urge you to just take a couple minutes to look at each of those. And those are what I'm referring to as association areas. The last part of this lecture we will talk about the cranial nerves. They are peripheral nerves. They are coming off of different areas of the brain.